Each day, we get to make a choice. Are we going to love God, or are we going to love something else? And our answer to that question can tell us a lot about what our lives are going to look like. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Hey, welcome. My name is Noah Dieselkamp, and the purpose of this channel is to teach people more about God, about Jesus, and about the Bible. And so, if you're here, I hope that this video today helps you with those things and encourages you in your walk with God. This particular channel has a particular purpose. I live in the North Austin area, and I am trying to connect with this community and help people learn more about Jesus and about the Bible. So if you live in the greater Austin area, I would love to hear from you. And I'd love to meet up with you, either in person or online, so that we can help each other in our walk with God and be better servants in His kingdom. Now, with that, let's return to 1 John chapter 2. In 1 John chapter 2, beginning in verse 15, the Apostle John writes this: "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." Now in verse 15, John makes it clear that loving the world and loving God are incompatible. They're irreconcilable. They just don't mix. And this isn't a soft suggestion. It is a statement of fact. Love for God and love for the world are mutually exclusive. Now, of course, we need to understand this passage in the context. We need to understand what John is saying in the context here. Verse 16 makes it clear that what John is saying here is not only should God be top priority in our lives, He should take priority over everything and anything else with no exceptions. But on top of that, we are also to reject the evil and sinful and ungodly ways of the world, the worldviews and the values that it presents in contrast to God's. That's to be rejected. It's to be pushed out. And this is a decision that faces us every day. Will we love God or will we love the world? And that choice has consequences. Look again at verse 16. In verse 16, John summarizes all that is in the world in the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life. And he says these things are not from the Father. Our decision here will naturally flow out of our first choice, because if we have chosen to love God, then we will naturally want to reject these lusts, these desires that John lists here. But if we have not consciously chosen to love God, then our decision will have already been made for us. Because essentially what's being talked about here is a battle of wills. Whose will do we submit to? Will we choose to submit ourselves to God's will? Or will we allow ourselves to be overtaken by the desires and the lusts of the world? This is an important decision, and it comes from our first decision. Let's dig in a little bit and let's look at these lusts that John lists here in verse 16. First is the lust of the flesh. That's what the flesh wants to do. It's this obsession that we have, things that we want to do, that we want to experience. The lust of the eyes. That's the things that we want to have. That's what we typically talk about in terms of covetousness or jealousy or envy. The things that we want to have. That's the lust of the eyes. And then the pride of life, that's what the flesh wants to be. It's this idea of self-ambition and pride. So we've got what the flesh wants to do, what the flesh wants to have, and what the flesh wants to be. Because the flesh, if left to its own desires, if not brought under the bounds of self-control and the control of God, it wants stuff. It wants things. That's these desires that John is talking about in verse 16. The irony is that when we give in to our own desires, we often feel like we're finally in control, but we're not. Giving in to our whims is the exact definition of not being in control, not being self-controlled or God-controlled. So what does it look like when we love the world? It looks like this. We become concerned with doing and having and being what we want, instead of submitting our will to God's. That is, doing what He wants, being content with what He has given us, and being who He has called us to be. We were created for a purpose. God's intention for us is not just to stuff our lives full of as many exciting experiences and pleasurable sensations as possible. We have a higher calling than that. We already read here in chapter 2, verse 17, that whoever does the will of God abides forever. That's what God has intended for us. God has not called us to an endless pursuit of material gain, nor to some sort of rat race for the top spot in our community. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 8 tells us, "For we have brought nothing into this world, and we cannot take anything out of it. But if we have food and clothing, with this we shall be content." God created us with an identity and for a purpose. And to warp that, or try to change it, or to find our identity or our value in something other than God, is to miss the point. God created us for so much more than the desires of this world. This world is passing away along with its desires. John says that in verse 17. Put another way, everything that matters to me, everything that is important to me, that does not relate to Christ and His kingdom, will fade into nothing. It will become meaningless. It will not matter. The inevitable end of loving the world, the inevitable end of pride and self-ambition and desire, is to pass away. And if we invest ourselves in those things, we too will pass away. But God has something better. God intends a meaningful and eternal existence for us. But that existence is inextricably linked. It cannot be separated from the will of God. John says here in verse 17, whoever does the will of God abides forever. So, in one direction, we have a path that leads to nothingness, where everything will pass away. And in the other direction is the opportunity to abide forever. And we may sit here at the crossroads and ask ourselves, where does our life lead? And that takes us all the way back to our first question. Do we choose to love the world, or do we choose to love God? If we truly love God, then we will humble ourselves and we will submit to His will, not to the will of our flesh. And John writes here in verse 17 that those who submit to His will, those who do God's will, they're the ones that will abide forever.